The year was 1978, and I was 15 years old. My best friend had returned to Japan after spending a year attending her junior high school in the States, while her father was a visiting professor at the local university. I missed her terribly after she had gone, and was able to persuade my grandfather to send me to Japan to visit her during that coming summer. I arrived on a July evening, completely exhausted, of course, yet terribly excited. My friend and her mother showed me to my room, which was the only traditional Japanese room in the home, one with tatami matting and sliding doors. This is a feature common to fairly affluent homes in Japan, modern construction and conveniences for the majority of the house with one traditionally Japanese room. I recall that when my mother opened the corner closet to retrieve the futon mats that would be my bed, a cold chill emanated from it. I thought nothing of it. Of course, an enclosed space would be less affected by the ambient temperature of a room, and I slept very soundly that first night. The following night after I had retired, I lay awake, listening to the sounds of the house as it was winding down for the evening. I heard light switches click off and bedroom doors upstairs closing. I was imagining what new adventures we may have tomorrow. I then began to hear a faint laughter. It seemed to be coming from perhaps the neighboring house. Perhaps there was a little get-together over there. Then the laughter became louder. Then the laughter became closer. Now the laughter was menacing. It was a decidedly evil man's laughter, which was now closed in around my ears, growing louder and louder. Just get up and go upstairs and get your friend, I told myself. I was wide awake. I tried to do just that, only to find that I couldn't move. Not a muscle. My instinct and unusual spiritual training from a young person kicked in. I had practiced yoga since I was a young child, and just before leaving, my yoga instructor had mentioned something about an East Indian holy man named Ramana. The mere mention of his name dispelled negative energies. I tried to say his name aloud. I was ready to try anything. To my horror, I discovered I could also not speak. Fear freezes, my instinct told me. What I have to do in the midst of this terror is to relax. I began imagining myself floating through a starry night sky. A calm in the midst of the storm around me came over me. I tried to speak the name of the holy man again, and this time I was able to mouth the word, though still no sound came out. Ramana. As I did so, it was as if a switch had been turned off. The evil laughter which had become deafening about my ears stopped. I was able to move and considered running upstairs to my friend. Yet, somehow, I knew that I was safe now, so I thought I would not wake her. The following day, a number of my friends' friends came by for a welcoming tea. I told the story of what had happened to me. Oh yes, that was Kanishibari, they told me, quite matter-of-factly, which means wrapped in bandages. It was a common thing which occurs in Japan whereby some spirit or another who happens to be roaming about decides to have a bit of fun with a resting human. They proceeded to tell me of other tales of spirits, both playful and malevolent, who specialize in turning children around in their beds so that their head would be where their feet had been when they awoke. They were not surprised in the least by my experience, and had no trouble believing that I had indeed been awoken and that that was no dream. The entity was likely a demonic one, judging from my description, they said, and I imagine that anyone who heard that laughter would concur. The direction from whence the laughter had originated, I realized, had been the bedding closet which had exhibited the chilly draft the night before. I took from that experience the notion that calm in the presence of malevolent entities is a powerful strategy. Indeed, my later studies of martial arts would serve to underscore that conclusion. "Don't strike when you are angry," I once heard a Tibetan monk remark. "You might miss." I had wanted to visit Takashima Castle on the shores of Lake Suwa in Nagano Prefecture and finally drove there in late autumn of 2006. After getting lost on the way, my friend and I arrived at a small park with a dungeon building and a moat at around 6:30 p.m. It was dark, and the main building, now a museum reconstructed in the 1960s, was closed and locked up. I was a bit disappointed that I couldn't enter and check out the museum, but was still happy to be there. I began fooling around, first climbing up the castle wall a little bit, ninja style, then proceeded up the stone flight of stairs to the locked doors of the main keep. I jokingly knocked on the door and gave the handle a tug. Yes, it was locked. I went to get my keys out of my pocket once again, jokingly, and as I did, my friend took her high-heeled boots off and ran off back down the stairs. "Did you hear that?" she yelled. I remember hearing some kind of sound coming from behind the door, but nothing that registered. I gingerly went back to the bottom of the stairs and asked what was wrong. Then, from the top of the stairs coming from inside the keep, a man's laughter rang out. We froze and looked at each other, not speaking, then backed up at the door. It sounded like the voice of a 40-ish-year-old Japanese man. Uh-oh, I thought, as I waited for a security guy or a groundkeeper to come out and tell me off. But just laughter, I thought, was a bit odd. 30 seconds seemed to pass, and as we gazed up the door, suddenly from very close, no more than 3 meters in front of me, and from seemingly thin air, the laugh started again loudly. Adrenaline kicked in, and I grabbed my friend and said, "Run, run, run!" We ran our jelly legs in the opposite direction, my friend almost in tears from the fright. "Gomenasai!" "I'm sorry," I said aloud in Japanese, my voice shaky as we passed through a gate out over the moat bridge. Then as we stopped for a breath once more, seemingly from a top window of the keep, another burst of laughter. I was glad he, or it, hadn't followed us, but my friend was pretty damn scared, and so was I. We got back to the car and drove off with one memory we'd never forget. As for me, I had more respect for old sites full of bloody and violent history. I'm currently studying overseas in Japan, visiting my relatives and all that jazz. They live 3 kilometers from the infamous suicide forest. To make sense of this story, I'd probably have to go back to 4 days earlier. My grandmother had been insisting on my visit for a long time because of me being in the country. At first I wasn't too keen on it, but I thought, why not? And finally went. I had to wait for break though, so it took a while. Fast forward to actually arriving at her house, my grandmother had already contacted my mother about the matter of staying with her, and it was fine. I'm a little bit skeptical about the existence of the paranormal. I've watched ghost adventures, ghost hunters, etc. I'm not all that religious either. I can never stand still in church, and the only time I can remember myself going was when I was 10 years old. My aunt had told me they would have food, and she lied. I think there might be a higher power, but I'm not sure. However, what I'm experiencing is convincing me otherwise about the existence of the paranormal. Upon entering the house, I noticed immediately that A, it was incredibly small, and B, there was a sudden feeling of extreme cold on my chest, like somebody took super cold ice and stuck it there. I asked my grandmother if they had an AC or a fan going, but she said no. I brushed it off as just my imagination. My grandmother's house had been around for God knows how long. It's old enough for people to actually see signs of wear and tear in some places. The inside is the modern 1 living room, 2 bathrooms, 2 bedrooms plus a guest room, and a small backyard. Upstairs is the guest room that overlooks the backyard. One of the bathrooms is also upstairs. I mostly stayed in the house and explored the backyard, which has an awesome Zen garden. I got to watch NHK with English subtitles. It's a Japanese TV channel. Google it. There were no incidences the first day other than that ice-cold feeling in the middle of my chest. I got the bedroom upstairs, which was above my grandparents' room. It was a traditional room with tatami mats and sliding door that separated the room into halves. The first half of the room is the one you see when you walk in through the door. There are shelves with manga, anime, music, sandals, a small umbrella, etc. The second half after you open the sliding door is where the flat bed thingy on the floor is, and the window straight ahead overlooking the garden. I stooped to put my possessions in the bottom shelf when I was in the first half of the room. When I stood back up, I felt a weird, heavy sensation in my chest, the kind you get when you fall really fast towards something. I began to get dizzy and actually fell to my hands and knees. There was spots in my vision. As soon as it began, it stopped. I was about to get up while wondering what brought that on when the same cold sensation from earlier hit my chest but much harder. I also felt cold around my neck and couldn't breathe. I was terrified and wanted to get help, but I couldn't get a word out. This lasted for 30 seconds, but it felt much longer than that. As soon as I got my breath back, I rushed downstairs to tell my grandmother. She asked if I had health problems prior to the incident. Of course, I said no because I'm a healthy person and I hardly get sick. She told me to sit down in the kitchen as she went to make tea. It tasted nasty. She told me it would help me with my being ill. I was scared to go back upstairs, but she said I had probably been dehydrated and might have caught something. The rest of the night went without anything happening. The second day nothing happened as well, but in the night I thought I heard a woman talking near the window. It was a gentle voice, but there was a note of guilt in it. It sounded like she was apologizing, and that the apology was directed at me. I could feel someone there as well, but I thought I was just being paranoid. Until that same cold feeling in my chest came when the voice and presence started. I put the blanket over my head and eventually went to sleep. Which all leads to now. I haven't been able to get much sleep. Grandmother thinks I'm sick. She even told me today that I look like I have eriguma, raccoon, due to the dark circles under my eyes. The sensations are still happening at night. I was hesitant to share my story, but my friends encouraged me, so I'm giving it a shot. I've started having a dream over and over again as well. It has a reoccurring pattern. The dream usually happens right after I can't stay awake any longer and fall asleep. I end up in a forest in broad daylight with thick fog. There's a dirt path that leads to a cliff. I'm probably on a mountain. I don't know because once I come out the forest, there's no detours and a sheer drop 2.5 feet in front of me where the dirt path ends. I can't see anything in the distance. I can't go back the way I came. There's grass everywhere. That's when a falling woman comes out of nowhere and falls past the rocky edge of the cliff with her arms outstretched, like she's trying to catch herself on said edge. She always misses. That was the first time, but now every time she comes falling down, an overwhelming urge to catch her takes me over. I run for the edge of the cliff, only for my hand to merely brush hers and miss. Sometimes I'll hear a splash of water way far down, and everything becomes icy, just unbearably cold. I can't see the water, but when the splash is heard at times, it feels like my whole body is drenched in ice and I can't breathe, like I'm drowning. I told my grandmother, and at first she didn't believe me, until last night. I actually caught the falling woman in my dream. When I caught her wrist and she took hold of mine, excruciating pain in my shoulder and wrist like I'd caught something heavy with one arm. She had a really tight grip. She looked to be 20 years old. She had long brown hair, brown eyes, and she wore a dirty white dress that looked like it went through the mud. Her skin was a bit tan, but also pale. She had streaks of mud on her face. The woman said the same thing that the lady by the window did. I'm sorry. To be honest, it scared me. I woke up today with red hand marks around my wrist, and my shoulder felt almost dislocated. My grandmother doesn't really know what to do, but she is researching. I can't sleep because I'm scared of the dream. I don't stay upstairs by myself. I completely avoid it during the day, and I stay up as much as I can despite being so tired. I just don't want to go to sleep. I still get the sensations in my chest and around my neck, but they're less intense, strangely gentle in some instances. I can still feel her presence. I don't know what she wants. I need help. Any advice is appreciated. In May of 2008, I went to the island of Saipan. Saipan is near Guam in Japan. Before World War II, Saipan belonged to the Japanese. The Japanese had an airport there that had military buildings and bomb shelters. In World War II, the U.S. military fought for the island of Saipan and took it away from the Japanese. The bomb shelters are well built and still standing today. The new airport is built nearby. On a beautiful sunny day, I was exploring a bomb shelter. I was alone and happy and having a nice relaxing time. Birds and insects were making their usual noise, and it was really peaceful. I went into the small door in the middle of the bomb shelter and stood just inside the door. I looked at the two rooms for people on the left and right side of the door. The two rooms were empty except for some crumbled concrete, litter, and some rusted metal sticking out from the walls. The light in the bomb shelter was pretty bright since it was so sunny outside. As I was standing there right inside the doorway, quietly looking around, the light suddenly started to get really dim inside the bomb shelter, and I heard a rushing sound in my ears. The rushing sound was like if you put coffee cups over your ears, but much louder. Then a shadow rushed right by me and sat down on the bench seat that was now mounted on the formerly rusted metal sticking out from the wall. Several more shadows rushed by me and sat on the bench seats. One shadow would rush to the left room, and the next would rush to the right room. The shadows were rushing by about every second, and if they had both gone the same direction, they would have collided. It looked like they had practiced drills of rushing into the bomb shelter quite a bit before, and I could see the shadows. They looked like they were made out of gray cigarette smoke. I could see their head and bodies, but not their hands or feet. I saw that they were thin Japanese soldiers. They looked like they were about 5 feet tall and weighed about 100 pounds or less. Their uniforms were tidy and well maintained, but the cloth looked like it was thin and getting worn out. I noticed that they all had their hats still on too. Nobody lost one during the rush. As each soldier rushed to the bench, he scooted over and made as much room as he could for the next guy. All the soldiers stared at the door and hoped more soldiers were coming. As each shadow rushed by, I realized there was not enough room in the doorway, and they were actually going through me to get inside the bomb shelter. I could feel them pass through me. It felt the same as if I was holding my breath and releasing it as each shadow passed by. They were rushing by about one shadow per second. Then I could hear a loud rumble approaching in the distance and a few explosions. I could see the soldiers were still looking at the open door and waiting for the rest of their comrades. There were a few more empty spaces on the benches. I turned to look at the door too, and I was surprised by the really bright light from the sunny day outside. The noise stopped at that moment. I turned back to look at the soldiers, and the bomb shelter was bright again, and all the shadow soldiers were gone. I thought nothing of it. Of course, an enclosed space would be less affected by the ambient temperature of a room, and I slept very soundly that first night. The following night after I had retired, I lay awake, listening to the sounds of the house as it was winding down for the evening. I heard light switches click off and bedroom doors upstairs closing. I was imagining what new adventures we may have tomorrow. I then began to go upstairs and get your friend, I told myself. I was wide awake. I tried to do just that, only to find that I couldn't move. Not a muscle. My instinct and unusual spiritual training from a young person kicked in. I had practiced yoga since I was a young child, and just before leaving, my yoga instructor had mentioned something about an East Indian holy man named Ramana. The mere mention of his name dispelled negative energies. To hear a faint laughter. It seemed to be coming from perhaps the neighboring house. Perhaps there was a little get-together over there. Then the laughter became louder. Then the laughter became closer. Now the laughter was menacing. It was a decidedly evil man's laughter, which was now closed in around my ears, growing louder and louder. Just get up and glee excited. My friend and her mother showed me to my room, which was the only traditional Japanese room in the home, one with tatami matting and sliding doors. This is a feature common to fairly affluent homes in Japan. Modern construction and conveniences for the majority of the house with one traditionally Japanese room. I recall that when my mother opened the corner closet to retrieve the futon mats that would be my bed, a cold chill emanated from it. The year was 1978, and I was 15 years old. My best friend had returned to Japan after spending a year attending her junior high school in the States, while her father was a visiting professor at the local university. I missed her terribly after she had gone, and was able to persuade my grandfather to send me to Japan to visit her during that coming summer. I arrived on a July evening, completely exhausted, of course, yet terribly